I watched my fiancé Derek laugh as he scrolled through my laptop screen, pointing at my Etsy shop analytics. Seriously, Emma, 12 sales this month? You made what, $63? He shook his head, that condescending smile I'd grown to hate spreading across his face. Maybe it's time to get a real job instead of playing pretend entrepreneur. I sat frozen at our kitchen table, watching him mock the small jewelry business I'd poured my heart into for the past year. The handcrafted necklaces and earrings that had taken me countless late nights to perfect were just a joke to him. But what Derek didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that I'd lived this exact moment before. 2 years ago, I'd died in a car accident on my way to our wedding. I remembered everything: the screech of brakes, the impact, the slow fade to black. Then, I'd woken up in my childhood bedroom, 18 years old again, with every memory of my previous life intact. I knew exactly how this story would end if I let it play out the same way. Derek would continue to belittle my dreams while secretly planning to leave me for his secretary, Sarah. My business would fail because I'd lose confidence. I'd spend years working dead-end jobs, broken and defeated. But not this time. You know what, Derek? I said calmly, closing my laptop. You're absolutely right. $63 is nothing. I watched his smug expression deepen, completely unaware that I was already 3 steps ahead of him. The years of emotional abuse started when I was barely out of high school. My mother had always favored my older sister Claire, the responsible one, who'd married young and given her grandchildren. I was the family disappointment, the dreamer who wasted time on silly crafts instead of getting a practical degree. When I'd started dating Derek during my first senior year of college, my family had been thrilled. Finally, Emma was with someone who could straighten her out. Derek had seemed charming at first, but the put-downs began subtly. That outfit makes you look frumpy. Maybe you should order a salad instead. Your art hobby is cute, but it's time to focus on real life. My family reinforced every criticism. My father would nod approvingly when Derek suggested I pursue accounting instead of design. My mother would smile when he joked about my little projects at family dinners. In my previous life, I'd internalized all of it. I'd abandoned my creative dreams, settled for a corporate job I hated, and married Derek in a ceremony where I felt like a stranger in my own life. The jewelry business had been my last desperate attempt to reclaim some piece of myself, but by then, years of criticism had eroded my confidence completely. But death had given me clarity. In those final moments before the crash, lying in the hospital with Derek nowhere to be found, he'd been with Sarah, I'd realized the devastating truth. I'd let them all convince me I was worthless, and I'd wasted my one life believing it. This time, I had an unfair advantage. I knew exactly what was coming. 3 days after Derek's mockery, I made my decision. Instead of shutting down my Etsy shop like I had before, I was going to transform it into everything I dreamed it could be. But first, I needed information. I've been thinking about what you said, I told Derek that evening, curling up next to him on the couch. About getting serious about my future. He muted the TV, clearly pleased. That's my girl, I knew you'd come around. I want to learn about business, real business. Could you show me how to use some of those analytics tools at your company? I want to understand markets and customer data. Derek worked at Morrison and Associates, a mid-tier marketing firm where he was constantly bragging about his expertise in consumer behavior and digital marketing. He'd never shared any of this knowledge with me before. In my previous life, he'd insisted I wouldn't understand the complexities. Wow, Em, I'm impressed. Most of that stuff would go over your head, but I could show you the basics. Perfect. I smiled sweetly and let him believe he was educating his simple girlfriend. Over the next 2 weeks, I played the eager student while Derek showed me market research tools, social media analytics, and customer segmentation strategies. I asked innocent questions that made him feel smart while I absorbed everything. From my previous life, I already knew that sustainable, ethically sourced jewelry was about to explode in popularity. Minimalist designs would dominate. Personalization would become crucial. I also knew exactly which influencers were on the verge of major breakthroughs. But Derek was giving me something even more valuable: the professional tools and techniques to capitalize on that knowledge. See, this is why your little Etsy thing isn't working, he explained, pulling up market analysis software. You're not targeting the right demographics. Young professional women with disposable income, that's your market. But you're making grandma jewelry. I bit my tongue and nodded. You're so smart about this. Could you show me how to identify trending styles? He spent an hour walking me through trend analysis, completely unaware that I was taking mental notes for his future humiliation. The real planning began at night after Derek fell asleep. I'd learned in my previous life that my grandmother's antique jewelry collection, currently sitting forgotten in my mother's attic, contained several pieces made from extremely rare and valuable materials. My grandmother had inherited them from a great aunt who'd traveled extensively in the early 1900s. I also knew that a particular vintage necklace in the collection contained authentic Victorian-era opals that would be worth a small fortune to the right collector. But more importantly, I knew my grandmother's collection would be the perfect inspiration for a line of vintage-inspired pieces that would capture the emerging old money aesthetic trend months before it hit mainstream. And I convinced my mother to let me sort through the attic as a bonding activity. She was skeptical at first, but when I mentioned that Derek thought it was a good idea for me to learn about family history and heirlooms, she immediately agreed. It's wonderful to see Derek taking such an interest in your development, she said, beaming. He's such a stabilizing influence on you. I smiled and nodded while internally cringing. In the attic, I found exactly what I remembered. My grandmother's jewelry box, packed with pieces that told stories of travel and romance from a bygone era. I also found her detailed journals, which I'd forgotten about, documenting the origins and significance of each piece. These would become the foundation of my brand story, but the real treasure was the opal necklace. I carefully researched its potential value and found that similar pieces had recently sold at auction for between $8,000 and $12,000. More than enough seed money for my business expansion. I spent weeks photographing every piece, researching their historical significance, and developing a cohesive brand identity. I created detailed sketches of modern interpretations that captured the elegance of the originals while appealing to contemporary tastes. Most importantly, I crafted a brand story that emphasized heritage, craftsmanship, and timeless elegance. Meanwhile, Derek continued to mock my little hobby every chance he got. He'd bring it up at dinner parties, making jokes about my 12 customers while his friends laughed. He'd roll his eyes when packages of supplies arrived, asking when I was going to get serious about our future. Each snide comment was just more fuel for what was coming. 2 months after that night at the kitchen table, I was ready to launch the new version of my business. I'd used the proceeds from selling the opal necklace to invest in high-quality materials, professional photography, and a complete website overhaul. I'd also quietly built relationships with 3 emerging influencers who perfectly embodied my target aesthetic. The night before my launch, Derek found me at my computer, working on final preparations. "Still playing with your jewelry thing?" he asked, not even looking at the screen. "Honey, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time to call it quits. My boss mentioned there might be an opening in the accounting department. It wouldn't pay much, but it would be steady work." I looked up at him, this man who'd spent 2 years systematically destroying my confidence, and felt nothing but pity. "Actually, Derek, I'm launching something new tomorrow. Something big." He laughed. "Big? Ahem, you've made less than $200 in 6 months. How is that big?" "You'll see," I said simply. The next morning, I went live with my new brand, Heirloom and Company. Instead of random handmade pieces, I now offered carefully curated collections inspired by historical periods, each with its own story and significance. The Victorian Romance collection featured delicate pieces inspired by my grandmother's travels. The Art Deco Dreams line captured the glamour of the 1920s. The timeless minimalist collection offered modern interpretations of classic designs. But the real genius was in the execution. I'd used every marketing technique Derek had unwittingly taught me. I'd identified my exact target demographic: young professional women aged 25, 35 with household incomes above $75,000 who valued craftsmanship and authenticity. I'd optimized my website for search engines, crafted compelling social media content, and timed my influencer partnerships perfectly. Within 6 hours of launch, I'd sold 43 pieces. By the end of the day, I'd made more money than in my previous 6 months combined. Derek came home to find me packaging orders at our dining room table. "What's all this?" he asked, clearly annoyed that I'd taken over our shared space. "Orders," I said simply. "I told you I was launching something big." He picked up one of the packages, reading the shipping label with confusion. "You sold this much stuff in one day?" 43 pieces, actually, and 3 custom orders for next month. For the first time since I'd known him, Derek was speechless. But this was just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, Heirloom and Company exploded. The influencer partnerships I'd carefully cultivated began paying off as each woman showcased my pieces to their growing audiences. The brand story resonated powerfully with customers who were craving authenticity in an increasingly digital world. Orders poured in from across the country, then internationally. I reinvested every dollar back into the business, expanding my product lines and improving my processes. I hired my first employee, a fellow art student who understood the vision. I moved operations out of our apartment and into a small studio space. I trademarked my designs and began developing relationships with boutique retailers. Derek watched all of this with growing confusion and resentment. The woman he'd spent years convincing was incompetent was suddenly running circles around him professionally. But rather than supporting my success, he doubled down on his criticism. "You're getting lucky," he'd say when I celebrated hitting a new sales milestone. "This won't last. These trend things never do." "You're neglecting our relationship," he'd complain when I worked late fulfilling orders. "This obsession isn't healthy." "You're changing," he'd accuse when I stopped seeking his approval for business decisions. "You're not the woman I fell in love with." He was right about that last part. I wasn't the woman he'd fallen in love with. I was the woman I was always meant to be. My family's reactions were more complex. My mother oscillated between pride in my success and concern that I was becoming too independent. My father grudgingly admitted that maybe I'd found my niche, but worried I was getting ahead of myself. My sister Claire was openly jealous, making passive-aggressive comments about how some people get lucky, while she struggled with the responsibilities of motherhood. But it was Derek's reaction that interested me most. As my business grew, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd sulk when I received congratulatory messages from customers. He'd accidentally schedule dates during important business calls. He'd make increasingly desperate attempts to assert control over my time and attention. I recognized the pattern from my previous life. Derek couldn't handle being with a woman who was more successful than him. In my first life, he'd solved this problem by leaving me for someone he could control. This time, I was curious to see how he'd handle being completely outclassed. The answer came 6 months after my launch, when Heirloom and Company was featured in a major fashion magazine. The article, titled "The New Generation of Heritage Brands," showcased my work alongside established luxury companies. The day the magazine hit stands, I received over 300 orders and inquiries from major retailers wanting to carry my pieces. That evening, Derek arrived home to find me on a video call with a buyer from Nordstrom. "I'll need to review our production capacity," I was saying, "but I think we can absolutely fulfill an order of that size. Let me get back to you tomorrow with a timeline." When I hung up, Derek was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "That was Nordstrom," I said casually. "They want to carry 3 of my collections in 50 stores." Derek sat down heavily at our kitchen table, the same table where he'd mocked my $63 a month less than a year ago. "How is this happening?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice held no condescension, just confusion and something that might have been fear. "Hard work," I said simply, "and good business sense." That night, I lay awake listening to Derek toss and turn beside me. I knew what was coming next because I'd lived through his playbook before. Phase 1 had been mockery and belittlement. Phase 2 had been resentment and sabotage attempts. Phase 3 would be his desperate attempt to claim credit and insert himself into my success. I didn't have to wait long. "I've been thinking," Derek said over breakfast the next morning. maybe I could help with your business. I mean, I do have expertise in marketing and customer analysis. I could take over the business development side and let you focus on the creative stuff. I looked at him over my coffee cup. That's sweet of you to offer, but I have everything under control. Be realistic. You're talking about scaling to major retailers. You're going to need professional help. And who better than someone who loves you? I'm already working with a business consultant who specializes in fashion brands. I lied smoothly. But thanks for the offer. Derek's jaw tightened. I think you're making a mistake. You don't understand how complex these corporate relationships can be. I'll manage, I said, and returned to my emails. Over the next few weeks, Derek's attempts to insert himself into my business became increasingly aggressive. He'd interrupt client calls to offer his insights. He'd suggest changes to my marketing strategy based on his professional experience. He'd hint to friends and family that he was the brains behind the operation. But the more he pushed, the more I pulled away. I began taking meetings outside the apartment. I stopped discussing business details with him. I made it clear that Heirloom and Company was my company, not ours. Derek's frustration boiled over during a dinner with my parents. He'd had too much wine and clearly couldn't contain himself any longer. You know, the real key to Emma's success has been applying proven marketing principles, he announced to the table. I've been coaching her on customer segmentation and digital strategy. It's amazing what happens when you apply real business expertise to a creative venture. My father nodded approvingly. That's wonderful, Derek. Emma's always needed someone to help her think strategically. I felt the familiar surge of anger at my family's assumption that any success I achieved must be due to a man's guidance. But I also felt something new, complete confidence in my own abilities. Actually, I said calmly, Derek hasn't been involved in any of the business planning or strategy. This has been entirely my project. Derek's face flushed red. That's not exactly... It's exactly right, I interrupted. You've made it very clear that you think my business is a joke. I've built this completely on my own. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. My mother cleared her throat awkwardly. Well, I'm sure you both contributed in your own ways, she said diplomatically. But Derek wasn't done. Emma, I think the stress of rapid expansion is affecting your memory. We've been partners in this from the beginning. I pulled out my phone and opened my business banking app, turning the screen toward the table. This is my business account, only my name is on it. Derek has never had any access or involvement in the financial side. Then I opened my website's back-end analytics. These are my customer statistics. I've handled every aspect of marketing, customer service, and product development myself. Finally, I showed them my trademark documentation. Heirloom and Company is registered exclusively under my name. Derek has no legal stake in the business whatsoever. Derek's face went from red to white as the evidence of his lies laid out in front of everyone. Now, I continued, if you'll excuse me, I have a conference call with buyers from 3 major department stores in an hour. I need to prepare. I left Derek sitting at my parents' table, exposed and humiliated. But that was still just the warm-up. The real reckoning came 8 months later when Heirloom and Company was acquired by a major luxury conglomerate for $2.3 million. The acquisition had been in talks for months, but I'd kept the negotiations completely private. The deal would allow me to maintain creative control while gaining access to global distribution networks and manufacturing resources. The morning the acquisition was announced in the business press, I was packing for a trip to New York to meet with my new corporate partners. Derek found me in our bedroom, stuffing dresses into a suitcase. You sold the company, he demanded, waving his phone with the news article pulled up. I sold a majority stake, I corrected. I remain the creative director and majority stakeholder in the creative decisions. For $2 million? $2.3 million. Derek sat down on the bed, staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Emma, we need to talk about our future, about marriage, about combining our finances, about... Actually, Derek, we do need to talk, I interrupted. I'm moving to New York permanently to oversee the brand's expansion. The company is setting me up with an apartment in Soho. Moving? His voice cracked. What about us? What about our engagement? I turned to face him fully, this man who'd spent years convincing me I was worthless, who'd mocked every dream I'd dared to voice, who'd systematically undermined my confidence and ambition. Our engagement was based on the person you wanted me to be, I said calmly. Someone small and dependent and grateful for your guidance. But that's not who I am. Emma, you're being dramatic. We can work this out. I could move to New York too. I could help you manage all this wealth. You're going to need financial advice, investment planning. I almost laughed. Derek, you make $42,000 a year at a mid-tier marketing firm. I just sold my company for more than 50 times your annual salary. What exactly do you think you could teach me about managing wealth? He flinched as if I'd slapped him. Besides, I continued, I already have a team of financial advisors, legal experts, and business consultants. People who actually respect my intelligence and capabilities. This isn't you talking, Derek said desperately. Success has changed you. You've become cold and calculating. No, I said, zipping up my suitcase. I've become who I always was underneath the insecurity you and my family spent years instilling in me. I've become the woman who is confident enough to build a multi-million-dollar company from scratch. Derek was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was small and defeated. I made a mistake, didn't I? I should have supported you from the beginning. I looked at him with something approaching sympathy. Derek, you didn't just fail to support me. You actively tried to sabotage my confidence every chance you got. You mocked my dreams, belittled my abilities, and tried to convince me I was lucky to have someone willing to fix me. I was trying to help you be realistic. You were trying to keep me small so you could feel big. I picked up my suitcase and headed for the door. That's not love, Derek. That's control. As I reached the doorway, I turned back one more time. Oh, and Derek, I know about Sarah. His face went white. Emma, I can explain. You don't need to explain anything to me anymore. My lawyer will be in touch about the apartment lease. You can stay until the end of the month. I walked out of that apartment and that life, leaving Derek exactly where he deserved to be, alone with the consequences of his choices. But the real catharsis came 3 months later, when I was settled into my new life in New York. Heirloom and Company had expanded into international markets, and I was being featured on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine as one of the 30 under 30 business innovators. The photo shoot was scheduled for the same week I received an email that made me smile. It was from Derek. The subject line read, Business Opportunity. Emma, I hope you're doing well in New York. I've been following Heirloom & Co.'s success in the news, and I'm incredibly proud of everything you've accomplished. I'm writing because I'm currently exploring new career opportunities and wondered if you might have any openings at your company. I have extensive experience in marketing and customer analysis, and I think I could be a valuable addition to your team. I'd be open to relocating to New York and would be flexible on salary and position level. I know things ended poorly between us personally, but I hope we can put that aside and focus on the potential for professional collaboration. I've learned a lot about supporting entrepreneurship and would love the chance to contribute to your continued success. Please let me know if you'd be willing to discuss this opportunity. Best regards, Derek. I read the email 3 times, savoring every desperate word. Then I forwarded it to my assistant with a brief note. Please send a standard rejection response. No interview necessary. 30 minutes later, I received another email from Derek, this one more frantic. Emma, I think there might have been a misunderstanding. I'm not looking for a standard job application process. Given our history and my intimate knowledge of your business's early development, I was hoping for a more direct conversation about how I could contribute to your team. I want to be clear that I recognize and respect your role as the founder and leader of this company. I'm not trying to diminish your accomplishments in any way. I simply think my background in marketing strategy could complement your creative vision. Would you be open to a brief phone call to discuss potential opportunities? Derek. This time, I decided to respond personally. Derek, thank you for your interest in Heirloom and Company. After careful consideration, I've determined that your qualifications and experience are not aligned with our current needs or company culture. We are looking for team members who believe in supporting women's entrepreneurship and who have a track record of recognizing and nurturing talent. Based on our previous interactions, I don't believe you meet these criteria. I wish you the best in your future endeavors. Emma Chen, founder and creative director, Heirloom and Company. I never heard from Derek again directly, but 6 months later, my assistant mentioned that he'd been calling the company's main number, requesting to speak with me about partnership opportunities. She'd been instructed to inform him that Miss Chen was not available and would not be available for the foreseeable future. Around the same time, I learned through mutual friends that Derek had been let go from Morrison and Associates. Apparently, his productivity had declined significantly after our breakup, and he'd been making increasingly erratic comments about how his expertise was being wasted in his current role. He'd also been telling colleagues that he was the uncredited co-founder of a major fashion brand and that he was planning to launch his own luxury business with his insider knowledge of the industry. When his bosses looked into these claims and discovered that Derek had no actual connection to any successful fashion company, they'd questioned his honesty and professional judgment. The final straw came when he'd pitched a jewelry line to a potential client using designs and brand concepts that were clearly stolen from Heirloom and Co.'s public materials. He'd been fired for plagiarism and was now working temporary admin jobs while trying to rebuild his professional reputation. My family's reaction to my success had been its own journey. My mother had gone through stages of confusion, denial, and finally grudging pride. She'd started including my business achievements in her holiday newsletters and bragging to her friends about her entrepreneurial daughter. My father had apologized in his awkward way for doubting my unconventional approach, and now regularly sent me business articles he thought I'd find interesting. But it was my sister Claire's response that surprised me most. She'd initially been bitter about my success, making snide comments about lucky breaks and overnight success stories. But when I'd offered to fund a small business loan for her to start her own catering company, something she'd always dreamed of but never pursued, she'd broken down crying. "I was so jealous," she'd admitted. "I convinced myself that you were just getting lucky because it was easier than admitting I was too scared to take risks." Claire's catering business was now thriving, and we'd developed a closer relationship than we'd ever had before. She'd become one of my most vocal supporters, often posting about Heirloom and Company on social media and recommending my pieces to her clients. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal and spiritual. Living in New York, running a successful company, being surrounded by people who respected my intelligence and creativity, I'd blossomed into a version of myself I'd never imagined possible. I'd developed friendships with other women entrepreneurs, traveled internationally for business, and been invited to speak at conferences about building authentic brands. But more than any external validation, I'd reclaimed my own sense of self-worth. I no longer needed anyone else's approval to know I was valuable. I no longer questioned my instincts or apologized for taking up space. I'd learned to trust my own judgment and to surround myself with people who supported my growth rather than stunting it. 2 years after moving to New York, Heirloom and Company had become a globally recognized brand, featured in fashion weeks in Paris and Milan. I'd been invited to the White House for a summit on women's entrepreneurship. Forbes had estimated my net worth at over $8 million. I'd been asked to serve on the boards of 3 different organizations supporting young women in business. I'd also started a scholarship fund for young women from abusive families who wanted to pursue entrepreneurship but lacked financial resources. The Emma Chen Foundation had already helped launch 43 small businesses, and I received thank you letters regularly from women who'd escaped situations similar to my own original circumstances. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came during a business conference in Chicago, when I was the keynote speaker at an event about overcoming obstacles in entrepreneurship. As I stood before an audience of 800 business professionals, telling my story about building a company despite family doubts and an unsupportive partner, I spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Derek was sitting in the back row, having somehow gained entry to the event. He looked older, more worn down, and was furiously taking notes as I spoke about the importance of believing in yourself despite external negativity. After my speech, as attendees approached the stage for networking and photos, Derek pushed through the crowd to reach me. "Emma," he said breathlessly, "that was incredible. I had no idea you'd achieve this level of success. I'm so proud of what you've built." I looked at him calmly, surrounded by business leaders and entrepreneurs who valued my expertise and insights. "Thank you," I said simply. I was wondering, he continued, lowering his voice, if we could grab coffee sometime. I'd love to hear more about your expansion plans. I have some ideas that might be valuable, and I'm currently between projects, so my consulting rates are very flexible. I felt the eyes of several other conference attendees on us, people who'd been listening to our conversation with growing interest. One of them, a venture capitalist I'd been talking with about potential investments, raised an eyebrow at Derek's obvious pitch. I appreciate the offer, I said, loudly enough for the surrounding group to hear. But Heirloom and Company works exclusively with consultants who have proven track records of supporting women-led businesses. We've found that approach aligns better with our company values. Derek's face flushed as he realized he'd been publicly dismissed. Of course, I understand. I just thought, given our history, I interrupted gently, is exactly why we wouldn't be a good fit for professional collaboration. He opened his mouth to respond, but I'd already turned away to continue my conversation with the venture capitalist about expanding into emerging markets. As I walked away, I caught a glimpse of Derek standing alone in the crowd, clutching his notebook full of desperate schemes to insert himself into the success story he'd once mocked. But I felt no anger toward him anymore, just pity for a man who'd been so insecure in his own abilities that he'd tried to diminish someone else's light rather than working to brighten his own. 6 months later, I received the news that brought my journey full circle. Heirloom and Company had been selected as the official jewelry partner for a major Hollywood film about women's empowerment in the 1920s. The costume designer wanted pieces that captured the spirit of women breaking free from traditional constraints and claiming their own power. As I sat in my Soho studio, designing a collection inspired by the flapper era's rebellion against societal expectations, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. In my previous life, I died feeling like a failure, convinced that I was too weak and naive to survive in a world that seemed designed to crush women's dreams. But death had taught me the most valuable lesson of all. The only person who could truly defeat me was myself. Derek, my family, and everyone else who'd tried to keep me small had only had the power I'd given them. Once I'd reclaimed that power and redirected it toward building the life I actually wanted, they'd become irrelevant. Now, at 26, I was living a life beyond anything I'd imagined possible. I owned a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. I had a waiting list of celebrities wanting to wear my designs. I was dating a brilliant architect who celebrated my success and pushed me to dream even bigger. I was financially secure enough to support causes I cared about and help other women escape the cycles of abuse and self-doubt that had once trapped me. But most importantly, I'd learned to trust myself completely. I no longer second-guessed my instincts or sought external validation for my choices. I'd discovered that the woman Derek had tried to convince me I wasn't, strong, capable, worthy of success, was exactly who I'd been all along. The last I heard about Derek, he was working at a small marketing firm in suburban Chicago, still telling anyone who'd listen about his consulting work with major fashion brands. Occasionally, former mutual friends would mention that he'd been asking about me, claiming he was proud of how well his mentorship had worked out, and that he was considering writing a book about nurturing entrepreneurial talent. I'd learned to laugh at these reports rather than feeling angry. Derek's need to claim credit for my success was just another symptom of his fundamental inability to accept that he'd been wrong about everything that mattered. He'd convinced himself that dismissing my dreams and undermining my confidence had somehow been helpful, rather than acknowledging that he'd been an obstacle I'd succeeded in spite of, not because of. As I put the finishing touches on my latest collection, I reflected on the beautiful irony of my story. Derek had spent years trying to convince me that I was too naive and impractical to succeed in business. Yet I'd built a multi-million-dollar company using nothing but creativity, determination, and the business skills I'd developed entirely on my own. Meanwhile, Derek, who'd positioned himself as the practical, business-minded one in our relationship, had failed spectacularly in every professional endeavor since our breakup. The truth he'd never been able to accept was that supporting someone's dreams doesn't diminish your own accomplishments. It amplifies them. By trying to keep me small, he'd revealed the smallness in himself, but I was done looking backward. My future stretched ahead like an infinite canvas, and I had all the tools I needed to paint whatever masterpiece I could imagine. The scared, self doubting woman Derek had tried to keep me as was gone forever. In her place stood someone who'd learned the most powerful lesson life had to offer. When you refuse to accept other people's limitations on your potential, there's no limit to what you can achieve. And the best part? This was only the beginning.